Hello, I'm Dr. Charlie Collins. Let's talk about research methods. Today I'm going to talk about the measurement process. I will discuss conceptualization and operationalization, types of operational definitions, levels of measurement, and reliability and validity. Before we jump into our discussion, let's again turn to the running example of research on Airbnb. Please revisit my video on the research process for a short explanation. Again, let's say I'm interested in discrimination on Airbnb. Therefore, I am working with the concept of discrimination, or the idea of discrimination. We also sometimes in the social scientists call that the construct. The question for the social sciences is, how do we take a concept or construct like discrimination and turn it into something that we can measure and do research on? Fortunately, as scientists tend to do, we've set up a process for that. This process includes the conceptualization and operationalization, the selection of operational definitions, identifying levels of measurement, and understanding reliability and validity. Our process first starts with the existing literature on the topic. This is the place where we can start to clarify our concepts. This is conceptualization. In our case, we're talking about discrimination. If I asked you to measure discrimination, you may give me some examples of discrimination or a general definition of the idea, but it may be difficult to tell me how exactly to measure it. That's why we turn to the literature. As part of this process, we want to examine the literature on discrimination and related concepts, such as stereotyping perhaps. At this point, we will want to see what others have said about discrimination, how they've defined it, and what makes up the concept. Based on our examination of the concept, we will want to provide a clear definition that fits our research. Because definitions of concepts and constructs like discrimination can vary, we want to use something that fits our research, but still acknowledge other definitions and understand other definitions. So, for something like discrimination on Airbnb, I may define it as the withholding of resources from certain groups of people based on characteristics such as race. The next step in our process is to operationalize our construct. Operationalization is the process of identifying ways to measure our concept. Again, we would turn toward the literature on our construct. We do this because it's likely that others have already operationalized it earlier and have validated those indicators. We'll talk about validation in a minute. An indicator is some way to measure our concept. Again, for discrimination, we may measure it in a more direct way, such as whether the host denied a request or not, or a more indirect way by rating the response for the email from the host, for example. Given the complexity of our concepts, we will use more than one indicator to measure our concept. This is very typical in the social sciences because a single indicator may not capture all of the characteristics of a particular concept. Moving on to the selection of operational definitions. There are two types of operations, manipulated and measured. Manipulated operations are those that attempt to change values on a variable, whereas measured operations are those that are measuring the values of a variable without manipulating them. Manipulated operations are those most often found in experimental research, where we are messing with the context to see if it changes the outcomes. Measured operations are those that make an attempt to measure and understand existing phenomena without trying to change them. For our Airbnb example of discrimination, we may want to try and influence discrimination among hosts. So what we may do is manipulate the types of people inquiring about rooms, meaning we may compare black men to white men and see if hosts respond differently. In contrast, for measured operations, we may search through Airbnb host pages to see if there are any indicators of discrimination or discriminatory behavior. For example, someone may say something like, "We prefer to host younger guests," which may indicate discrimination among older people. Now we need to talk about how we are actually measuring our concepts or variables, which brings us to our levels of measurement. Levels of measurement are most concerned with quantitative data. It allows us to take our concepts and turn them into numerical data for quantitative analysis. There are 4 ways to measure variables. These are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And note, some books put interval and ratio together. If you've taken statistics for the social sciences, you should be very familiar with these. I'm going to quickly define them and provide a short example of each. Nominal variables are those where cases are classified into categories on some variable. Race is almost always a nominal variable, where cases are classified into their respective racial categories. Ordinal variables, on the other hand, are similar to nominal variables, the difference being that the ability to rank those classifications or categories in some way belong to ordinal variables. Ordinal variables are typically used to rank cases on some scale. College class level is usually used as an ordinal variable because you can rank freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. Also, if you've ever filled out a survey that had questions such as rank the following items on a scale from 1 to 5, you've completed an ordinal variable. Interval variables are those where the intervals between each classification are the same. The most common examples are temperature or shoe size. For shoe size, the difference between an 8.5 and a 9 is the same as the difference between, say, a 10 and a 10.5. Those intervals are the same across the whole scale. Finally, ratio variables have the same characteristics as interval ratios, but with an absolute 0 point. Income is often used as an example of a ratio variable because if I have $0, for example, it literally means that I have no money. When conducting our research, it is necessary to identify the levels of measurement we're using because this will influence our analyses. And more often than not, we want to try to get as close to ratio as possible because ratio is a much more precise level of measurement compared to something like ordinal or nominal. The final step of measurement is making sure our operationalizations are consistent and accurately capturing what we are intending them to capture. These are reliability and validity, respectively. Reliability is concerned with the question, is our definition consistently measuring what we are intending it to measure? Validity is concerned with the question, are our measures accurately capturing the ideas that we are intending them to capture? There are a variety of ways to understand reliability and validity, which I will not get into here. However, it's important to know whether you are actually gathering the information you are intending to gather in a reliable way, or are you collecting something else? These are the things that reliability and validity try to identify within our research and within our measures. That is all we have for this discussion of measurement. By now, you should be familiar with conceptualization and operationalization of constructs, the selection of operational definitions, the identification of levels of measurement, and reliability and validity. Thank you for watching. I'm Dr. Charlie Collins. See you next time.